I appreciate the team leading us. I appreciate the words that we sung. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I hope that when we gather and when we worship, that we let these words land, that we recognize that God is among us, with us, that at all times there is a way, and He's making the ways around us. And that song fits so beautifully with the book of Ruth. And today, as we wrap this series up, I just want to do a bit of a recap. And if you've missed any of these messages, they are online, and I would encourage you to get caught up if you've missed any. And we started in chapter 1, and you look at the book of Ruth, and as we go through chapter 1, you had this, both Naomi and Ruth, you have extreme heartbreak, loss, and pain. And in chapter 1, there was a significant moment where Naomi made a decision to leave Moab and return to Bethlehem. In chapter 2, we talked about how Ruth and her loyalty, where she just works and waits and serves faithfully. When you think about Ruth, this book is written about her. In chapter 3, you watch her initiate surrender and trust. And in chapter 4, which is what we looked at last week, we looked at redeemed, restored, and rejoicing, that these are the things that are happening. And then this, as we talked about the Redeemer, about how Boaz was the kinsman Redeemer, we talked about him being a picture of Christ, our Redeemer. And it was great to have Jill share with us, and Ange and Jill, as Jill came and shared her story about how she has encountered Christ, her Redeemer. And hands up if you were here and remember the Boaz challenge that Jill issued last week. Joseph, what was the Boaz challenge? Oh, you weren't here. You were here, but you weren't paying attention. He was on sound. He was our sound guy last week. So, Tim, what's the Boaz challenge?
How simple is be a Boaz?
Be a Boaz.
What that meant, I believe, was do something unselfish to redeem someone else or do something for someone else.
Right. Jill drew out how Boaz, he brought compassion. He saw the marginalized. He not only saw, but he moved to actually meet the need. And her challenge was, imagine what would change our community if every one of us would be a Boaz for somebody else. Think about how that would impact our faith community, but even our community at large. And so she said for the next 2 weeks, find someone to be a Boaz for. And so we're going to keep that as a reminder that you actually do the Boaz challenge. It's interesting, as I talked about the seasons that we go through in our lives, and you think about the book of Ruth. Some of us, as we've gathered here today, we're in chapter 1, where you just feel kind of stuck. Some might be in chapter 2, where you are in this place where it feels like the in-between, where Ruth was, Naomi left, but they left together, and Ruth was in this season of, well, I'm not here, and I don't see God answering yet. And you find yourself in the in-between. And in those moments in chapter 2 and 3, when you find yourself in the in-between, you keep trusting God. And my prayer for you, as I've already prayed, my prayer for you is that in chapter 4 you will discover what Naomi discovered. That you will discover what Ruth discovered. I pray that you will discover that because of God, it can be better than you can imagine. That when God moves, when He intercepts our lives, it can be better than you can imagine. Because our God is good. He is faithful. And His word is true. As we continue today in concluding this series, God took years of brokenness and brought redemption and restoration. And I want us to read in chapter 4. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This passage that is the culmination, there's a lineage that comes after this in Ruth 4, but is the culmination of this journey from Moab to Bethlehem, of where God was distant to where he actually showed up in significant ways. We need to note and point out that Ruth and Naomi were in Moab for 10 years. Sometimes we read scripture and we read the chapter and it's like short little chapter and move on. That first chapter covered a 10-year period where they were in Moab. And sometimes life is like that, isn't it? For some of us, it's not just a chapter, this is a season that we find ourselves in. But there was one decision that changed everything. The decision to move from Moab to Bethlehem. And that one decision that Naomi made changed her life and Ruth's life. It changed their family, and it changed the legacy. That legacy impacts every one of us today. That legacy impacts every one of us today, because that legacy led to Christ coming. But how did this come about? There's a phrase that I want us to recognize here, and everybody say this with me: the Lord enabled. Say it again. The Lord enabled. These two words, I think, really mark the entire book of Ruth. These two words were happening the entire time. While everything was going on, God was at work. God was enabling. God was enabling. Say that again. How many want to learn some Hebrew today? No. The Lord enabled in Hebrew is that word or that script on top. Everybody say this: Yahweh we yitten. Yahweh we yitten. Say it again. It's just funny listening to you say it. Yahweh we yitten. Yahweh ye witten. The Lord enabled. This word, we yitten, enabled, is so powerful, has such deep meaning to it. In several translations, it's actually translated this way. In the NIV, it's enabled. The Lord gave, enabled, so enabled is gave in ESV, granted in the CSB, and the Good News translation uses the word blessed. All of these words so richly describe the Lord enabled. Yahweh we yitten. No matter how you say it, the bottom line, it was the Lord who did it. Yahweh we yitten. Friends, our God is an enabling God. He is a giving God. He is a granting God. He is a God who blesses. For you, you might have a different translation. You might say, the Lord, He is the Lord who has provided, the Lord who has healed, the Lord who has answered and restored. You might say, my Lord is the one who opened a door. My Lord is the one who has proven Himself faithful. My Lord is the one who made a way when there didn't seem to be a way. Yahweh we yitten. And as I stand here and look at the faces, there are so many stories just in who I see where you could stand and say, yes, Yahweh we yitten. He is the Lord that enabled. And this is the part of this story that just screams from everything that we see, that God is able. The story of Ruth, as it moves from Moab to Bethlehem, as she moves from poverty and working in the field and encountering Boaz, and even that was brought its own stresses. The thing that screams to me from this story is that God is able. Yahweh way yitten. Now to Him, to Him, to Him, to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. How many people ask God for stuff? Only 6? You know, it's actually okay. It's actually okay to put your hand up in church. You know, it is okay. How many ask God for things? Right? Like Tim's got 2 hands up. We all do. Right? How many have dreams with God? And you imagine, right? I think of okay, say this with me. Okay, so that means you're talking, okay? Now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. I should have bolded and underlined all. I ask a lot. I don't know about you. I ask a lot. I imagine a lot. I have dreams. I look and I pray for God to move. I have dreams for what I want to see God do in me, around me, in my family, around me, in this faith community, in our community. I have dreams for the impact that we have that goes, again, beyond here, like for Cuba and Uganda and everything that we put in locally and everything that we put our hands to. I can imagine big things. But all I can ask and all I can imagine, He has immeasurably more. God has immeasurably more than what you ask and what you can imagine. What are you asking for? What are you dreaming for? The biggest asks, be careful with that word, the biggest asks, the biggest dreams. Sorry, everybody just got distracted. The biggest asks, the biggest dreams that we have, God can do immeasurably more. According to His power, Yahweh way yitten. According to His power that is at work within us. What can God do? Whatever you need, God can do. Whatever you ask, God can do. Whatever you imagine, He can do. And more. Some of you might be thinking right now, if He can, why didn't He? If He can, why hasn't He? I'm sure that Naomi and Ruth might have thought the same exact thing. Where are you, God? Why didn't you do what I thought you would? Why didn't you heal that person? Why didn't you save that marriage, that relationship? Why didn't you come through the way I thought you would? Where are you? And you are waiting, stuck in chapter 2 and chapter 3. And friends, hear me. While you're waiting, God is still working. Yahweh way yitten. Just because you do not see it does not mean He's not active. I love this about the book of Ruth. Ruth kept her faith. She didn't let her current situation define her view of God. She trusted God is able. God has power. Every problem you face, God is able. Yahweh we yitten. Whatever you need, God is able. In verse 14, we see the provision. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better than 7 sons." That statement alone was huge. Because in this culture, daughters were good. But boys, sons, and they're declaring that because of Ruth, because of who she is, because of what's happened, because of Yahweh we yitten, because God has enabled, Ruth is better for you than 7 sons. It's interesting when you stop and think about this, about the journey for even Naomi. This might be one of those duh statements, but this was not her plan. It was not Naomi's plan to go to Moab. That was her husband's plan. It was not Naomi's plan for her husband to die. None of this was her plan. But God had a better plan. Obed and Ruth. Baby Obed. The name Obed means servant of God. Some of you right now are in a place that you did not plan to be in. And you may be disappointed about the place where you are, where you find yourself. But I want to remind you of the goodness of God. And He is able. And sometimes we have to sit and realize that God's plan was actually better. For Naomi and Ruth, how things happened wasn't their plan. But God was at work. I think of our own life, and you think about God's plan being better. Ange and I, when we were first married, we couldn't have kids. We tried, did what we could do, sought doctor's help, etc. And then there came this point where we just decided, okay, I guess this is just what life is. And then October, I get these dates mixed up. October 2000, right? Yes, Thanksgiving weekend. We decided to adopt. And March 12th, 2001, God gave us Lauren. I don't know who that guy is. What's the song, When I Wore a Younger Man's Clothes? The Piano Man, yeah. God gave us Lauren. Not our plan. But God's plan is better. We raised Lauren when she was almost 3. We decided that I was the youth pastor at that time when we adopted Lauren. Yeah, it was a transition time, and we were moved to Hamilton. And Ange and I, we had tried to adopt again during that time. Once Lauren reached 3, once she reached 2, we started trying to adopt again. And it was just one no after another. And after, for me, when I realized the toll it was taking on Ange because with adoption, you're presented to the future prospective parent, and they choose you, whether or not, like you do, it's like a resume. And they 6 times, once Lauren turned 2, 6 times we were presented to parents, always in the top 2, never selected. And the emotional roller coaster. So we decided that by the time it came to move to Hamilton, that if we hadn't adopted, we were done. No more. We're not going on this ride anymore. That was our plan. God had a different one. We arrived in Hamilton in April of 2004 and June, right? And June? May. Sorry, she's looking at the pictures. She's mad. I'm going through pictures and I'm like, I like that one. I like that one. I didn't get her approval. I'm sorry. There's a worse one coming. So May, we had a social worker. We told our social worker we were done. So she kind of closed her file. We get to Hamilton in May. Our social worker calls us and says, "You said you were done, but there's a mother and your profile matches." Okay, God. And Karina was placed in our home July 8th, the day after my birthday. And this picture of Lauren holding Karina was only, I think, within the day that she came. And so then Karina came into our lives. That wasn't our plan. God's plan was better. And we thought we were done. God had a different plan. April 19th. April 22nd. I got all these dates because I've got adoption dates, what we call got you dates, where you get them in your home, you have that date. I've got all these numbers. Nadia was born Good Friday, April 22nd, 2011. I knew that. And that was not our plan. I remember the day that it was August. I was sitting in my office off the back of our home. We had a pool in Hamilton, and both girls, I remember turning on my chair. I just finished writing a message and looked out the window over the pool, and I just kind of did one of these, school's coming, freedom. No more juggling schedules, no more trying to figure out the kids are going to be in school from this period to this period because they were in. And then Ange came home. She said, "I'm glad you're sitting down." And she told me that the doctors said it was impossible, but we have a miracle. She said I was catatonic for about a half an hour. We had a plan. God's plan was different. God's plan was better. And then we moved here in July 2011 and started coming to the bridge. And that obviously was taken in the fall of 2011. And here we are 22 years later. 13 years later. God's plan was better. I think and wonder, what if I had got my plan? What if it had happened the way I thought and even was pretty sure it was going to be? God's plan is better. We see the story progress in Ruth 4:17. It says, "The women living there said, 'Naomi has a son,' and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." The book of Ruth is all about the providence of God. Remember as we began the series, we did the Bible Project overview of Ruth, and that was one of the big statements, is that in this, and the providence of God means this: when God uses natural circumstances to bring about his supernatural will. In the book of Ruth, you don't see any physical miracles like parting of the Red Sea. There's no walking on water. There's no raising the dead. But you see the miraculous providence of God when he uses natural circumstances to bring about his supernatural will. The providence of God is like the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language is actually written backwards. The providence of God is like the Hebrew language. Providence of God is best understood when you look at it backwards and you see what he's done. Jesus came from Mary and Joseph, who came from Jacob, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce all these names. Jacob to Zadok, Azor to Jehoiakim, Josiah to Jotham, Uzziah to Rehoboam, Solomon, David, Jesse, Obed, Ruth, and Boaz. The providence of God moving all the way back to Ruth and Boaz. God's plan is always better. I find it, what's the word? Encouraging that Jesus was born from the lineage of Ruth, a Moabite woman. Moabites, if you didn't know this, worship the demon god Chemosh, who they sacrifice babies to. Ruth came from a people who were not of God, but she left Moab and found God in Bethlehem. This was Ruth's second marriage. Her first husband died. That was not her plan. And hear me, if you find yourself in plan B, God's plan is always better. If you find yourself in a world of disappointment, in a world of hurt, in a world of waiting, trust God. Hold on to God. He has something better. I love how the book of Ruth reveals the gospel. Ruth, foreigner, stranger, lost and broken in Moab. She leaves Moab and pursues the one true God in Bethlehem, where she finds herself lower than a servant, not worthy, not belonging. Boaz loves her, saves her, redeems her. And now she's not a slave, she's not a servant, but now she is family. She is his wife. And if you are here today and you are in Christ, that's your story. Once God felt far away, and you felt like a spiritual outsider. That's all of our stories for us who know Christ. If you're here today and you don't know Christ, for many of us, we can look back and we can remember the life without Christ where we were hurting, where we were broken, and we were hopeless. And I know so many people now in this world who without Christ, they are hurting. They are broken, and there's no hope. God, hear me. God has something better for you. His plan is better. And it's better than you can imagine. God sent his son Jesus to love you, to save you, to redeem you. In Ephesians 2, Paul says, don't forget. The NIV says, remember. Don't forget that you Gentiles used to be outsiders. That's all of us. In those days, you were living apart from Christ. You lived in this world without God and without hope. A life without Christ, without God, is a life without hope. But now, you have been united with Christ. Once you were far away from God, but now you have been brought near to him through the blood of Christ. So now you Gentiles are no longer strangers and foreigners. You are citizens along with all of God's holy people. You are members of God's family. I want us to sit in silence and meditate on that verse for a minute and think about where you are.